All right, so let's get down to floats. So last time we talked about, and I'm just going to do the styles inline so that we can see it, and it'll just be a raw CSS.
Yeah.
So we talked about display block, we talked about display inline, we talked about centering last time, and we also talked a little bit about middling, where you want to vertically center something, although we didn't get too far into that. This time we want to talk about first floats. So a float is the most common thing that a float's for. Let's see if we can find something on like an actual website, like Quora. So I'm seeing what I would call, if I was like a web developer in 1995, a 3-column layout. And on the left here, I have some side nav going on. In the middle, I have this main content section, and then I have like some sort of supplementary content on the right. Oh, it's doing some flex stuff. Okay, Flexbox is its own thing and is like a totally valid way to do things, but you're gonna see floats and you want to make sure you know how to handle them. So we'll just roll our own 3-column layout. So much like Quora, let's pretend we have a top bar up top, and then let's pretend we have the container under the top bar. I'm just gonna be real explicit so we can know exactly what everything is. And then inside of my container under the top bar, which just to make it visual, so the top bar is this white thing going across the top. Container under the top bar is going to be all of this gray stuff and all of the stuff inside of it. So, okay. And then within my gray container, I have 3 more little containers. So I'll do div class equals. So I could say left side nav, just as kind of like a tangent, but maybe worth mentioning. There was a period of time where people used to have a lot more opinions about this kind of stuff, and I'm sure lots of people still have opinions on it, but I think it's been generally accepted that there's a lot of ways to do it now. If you ever hear the term like semantic HTML or like semantic naming, what the adherence to that doctrine of belief would suggest is that you should never have class names that are aesthetic in nature or positional in nature, right? So rather than calling it like left side nav, you would want to name it based on the content within. Bootstrap straight up violates this, right? Like, Bootstrap has tons of stuff all over the place that's morphological in nature. But for us here, I just want to point that out. I don't think that there's necessarily a right answer, and there's like pros and cons of doing it both ways. The nice thing about semantic names is that even if this side nav content gets moved somewhere else, or it gets kind of maybe even carelessly copy and pasted somewhere else, it's still got a class name that doesn't like make it super confusing. So we'll just be sort of the worst of both worlds and just be like really specific. So like left side nav is this thing, and then we're gonna do like this middle. Can we call this like a card wall or maybe like a card stream? We'll have a card stream. Main content card stream. And we got our left side nav, and then maybe we do our like right bonus nav or bonus thing. Widget. We'll call it a widget. Okay, so we got our widget, and we've got our main content card stream. Which now, if we were in Bootstrap, this class card probably means something. So beware. Piece of content, and then over here there's some like links that go to omfgdogs.com, and the first one says something like feed, TechCrunch, etc. Okay, so let's take a look at our sweet thing. Okay, there it is. And let's put some stuff in that top bar. So it looks like home, answer, spaces. Okay, so let's start off by just kind of reviewing some of the stuff we did last time, just to get it looking reasonable. So who can help me get the top bar to look a little bit more like this?
Differentiated by a bottom line, or
that'll work. Anything really, Madison. Whatever comes to mind.
Okay, so I guess for the top bar you could put a bottom border on it. If you were so inclined, you could make the background color different to make it look like its own thing.
Gotcha. So maybe theirs is white. Maybe we should make ours green.
Nice.
All right. Cool. And we're not using a CSS reset, so we got all that extra stuff at the top. So I'll just do the quick and dirty version, which is not complete at all. So bear that in mind.
Yeah.
There you go. Maybe like reticent to use margin because of the reasons we discussed last time. Like I'm just kind of like paranoid and don't trust margin always to behave the way I want it, just because of margin collapsing, right? But let's go ahead and use it because we're being lazy right now. So margin bottom, just about 25 pixels. That's not going to be enough, but it's something.
It's good for testing, I suppose, and just a margin 0 real quick.
Well, margin 0, margin auto, totally understandable, makes sense. It's just when you start to use margins a lot for like layout and positioning that like, yeah, you can be surprised sometimes.
Dirty surprises. Yeah.
Totally. Okay, so there's our top bar, and now we've got, let's just make these all different colors. So we got left side nav. Let's do like background lemon chiffon. Magenta? Yeah. Cyan. All right, cool.
Nice.
Lemon chiffon, magenta, and cyan. And there are divs, which means they're display block by default, because remember, different kinds of elements have different default display properties. So anchors and spans and things that are just obviously text are display inline by default. Big surprise. Same thing for EM tags, strong tags, right? And things like divs and ULs and H1s and Ps, those are display block by default.
I think a lot of people that are new to CSS as well, they encounter it by noticing their styles aren't applying. And they're like, oh, I need to make this a div instead of a span.
Totally, yeah. So it's just a default. So you can override, like you could even say that all spans in your entire page are going to be display block.
Oh, okay. Like
right. That would be super confusing,
yeah.
But you could totally do that.
It could, like, be annoying.
And it would also be it would be annoying, and it wouldn't be a very specific CSS selector to do this, which we use less, right, all the time. So like when you do less, if you're like inside of like foobar and you put span in there, it's already like more specific because the less compiler is going to take that and it's going to compile it down to this.
Oh, okay.
Which is saying all descendants, all spans who are descendants of foobars get these styles. Right. Let's talk about what these different things mean. Also, there's no support.
They come in handy when you're looking up like examples online as well. People have all kinds of conventions and ways of arranging.
Yes, definitely, definitely. So other kinds of preprocessors you'll hear about are like stylus, Sass, and I'm pretty sure that there is a new one that's popular, which name I can't remember right now, that's like gotten like popular to the point that it's embarrassing. I don't remember what it is, but in case it's any indication how often these things change, bear that in mind. Cool. Okay, so we're looking at like just riding bareback with these CSS selectors. All right, so, I'm gonna trade off between you guys, and then if you don't know, just say you don't know. Totally fine. All right, so John, what is this first selector gonna apply to?
It's pretty much everything that at least has foobar as the class.
Yeah, that's actually a really good clarification. It's everything that has every element in the entire web page, right? Because this is just, we're assuming the CSS selector is like floating loose, and we're not using less or anything. So every element on the page that has at least the class foobar. Let's address that. So like, who can tell me what this, actually I should say, Madison, what would this do here?
I would think that that is referring to divs that are spans that have the class foobar on them.
That sounds right. And just when you say divs that are spans, you mean like elements that are spans, right?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
So it's like, in this case, instead of every element, it's like every span on the page that has at least the class foobar. And we avoid this kind of selector here by convention, just because if you end up needing to change this, it can be like a really confusing bug to figure out why your styles aren't applying.
Interesting.
It also fiddles with the specificity. So like this is a more specific selector, right? So we put foobar just for context, and I'll comment out the stuff we haven't gotten to yet. We put foobar just like above everything else. So right now foobar is just saying, I guess we should probably have it say the word foobar so we don't get confused about what it is. So there's foobar floating around up top. I'll blow it up so it's bigger. So then if we wanted their foobar to be red, we could put red there, foobar's red. And then if we put color green here, what would we expect to see, John?
Just going to change the text color to green. The color just itself applies specifically to the text, but the element has a span and foobar.
So why do you think that this one is going to take precedence over this one?
The hierarchy?
It's the specificity. First of all, it's definitely going to be green, as you can see. The reason why is there's actually two reasons. Okay, so like right now, the reason why, there is no one reason why. So one reason why is because this comes after the first selector. And so CSS applies its selectors in the order in which it is received, if there's a tie in specificity. So the first thing it'll use is specificity. So if I was to put this here, even though I listed green first and then red came later, it should still be green because span.foobar is a more specific selector. If you just remember the precedence of CSS selectors, like which actually override, like which one actually gets the order in which they apply, right? Which the style rules get applied is determined first by specificity and second by order. The precedence of CSS selectors, precedence of the style rules within each selector and how it gets applied, that's determined by first specificity of the selector, and second by the order in which the selector is listed on the page. And so if you have multiple CSS files and like you link in, in CSS you can do that with like an import. If I import another CSS file above here, then this thing would be considered coming afterwards. So it's just like after everything has been like worked out and you see it fully there on the page, it's like, what's the order of that? Because when we talk about the order of selectors, we're referring to like their final order within the HTML or the CSS page. Like if this wasn't span foobar, right? So right now, if I refresh the page, it's green because it's more specific. That gets applied, and then it looks at this one and it's like, oh, I don't need to apply that. I already, to this, to our foobar, I already have a more specific style applied to our foobar. And I say style, I mean a more specific selector, so I'm not going to apply that to ours. I'm not going to apply this color red because I already have a color, right? So if I was going to say like font size, I don't know, 24 pixels, like it's going to be green and 24 pixels. Or if I wanted to make it, font style, right, to make it italic, then like it's going to be italic but not red. Because this red rule is getting canceled out by the green, because this green was assigned by a more specific selector. And I guess so I need to clarify our little definition here. The precedence of CSS rules, the precedence in which any given style rule within the selector gets applied, is determined first by specificity of the selector and second by the order in which the selector is listed on the HTML page. So it's just like, it's the fact that this color has already been set, that's what is not going to be overridden but this stuff will still be merged in. Ideally, when you're using a preprocessor like Less, when you can use nesting, it helps avoid a lot of these problems because it makes sure that any of your CSS rules are like very specific. Or your CSS selectors, I should say. Remember, the selector is this part next to the curly. The rules are the individual things with semicolons, or inside of the selector. It's selecting an element or a set of elements on the page, and then it's applying the rules within. So this is saying for all things that have class of foobar, apply the rule of color red and the rule of font style italic. It's a more discerning selector, right? Whereas this selector is more general. I'll do one more example of this first. So if I go font weight bold, here, what should I expect to see? In fact, let's go ahead and put a div. We'll have foobar as span and then foobar as div, so we can see both happening. So there's foobar as span, it's bold, italic, and green, and foobar as div is red and italic and not bolded. And that's because foobar as span is green and bold, and then all foobars are red and italic. But because this selector is less specific, the rules that conflict with previously defined rules by a more specific selector, that rule is going to be not applied. So it's going to stay green if it's the span, but it'll still get the italics, and that's what we saw here. Green, italic, bold, red. If we wanted to override font style, or if we wanted to make font style like maybe normal, maybe? There we go. That'll apply because it's only on the span. So that's rule specificity. So then next, let's talk about this kind of a rule here. So we've got foobar as span and foobar as div. I'm going to actually remove the span version for a second. Let's just say we've got a div class foobar. We'll leave our rules from above, and let's just see what we have right now. So foobar is div, and that's it. So it still has all those styles, and it's working the same way as before. So if I have this selector, anything that has class foobar on it, we're gonna find those, and then we're gonna look inside of them to any, not just their children, but any of their descendants, any of their guts, all the way deep, that have that are spans. And then if they're spans, this will apply. These styles will apply. And what's gonna happen if I check it out now?
Same.
Right. Turquoise. Okay. So foobar's div is just foobar. But let's wrap foobar in a span. So like this is a span inside foobar, and it's a span inside foobar. Now it's turquoise. Other loose text in foobar, still red. This selector, because it has a space here, what that indicates is this is a descendant. So like this isn't matching foobar. And it's not matching all spans. It's matching like specifically spans, and because of this space, I know it's spans that occur inside of foobar. So it's like not only do you have to be a span, but you also have to be a span inside of something that has class foobar. Elements can be selected based on their name, attributes, context, and other aspects. And those aspects, I guess maybe here they're using kind of aspects, but really it's the condition. It's like the condition is being used to select the aspects. Okay, so like we have a loose div in a foobar, and then we have like a doubly nested div in foobar, and all that stuff's still there. So even within this doubly nested div within foobar, if we put another span, this is a span way deep in there, it's going to be turquoise. Any span which is inside of a class foobar, and so this span here is inside of something with class foobar, but this span is also inside of something with class foobar. And when we say descendants, that's what we mean. So it's not a child. It's not what we call a child. This one's a child.
Grandchild.
Yeah, it's like a grandchild.
Possibly even a great-grandchild. Because this one's a child. Because it's a direct descendant, right? But this is like, there's one more div here, and there's even another div here, meaning that this is great-grandchild.
There we go.
And this is like...
Grandchild.
We go right to left. So we're looking for spans that happen to be inside of something that has class foobar. So we look for spans, all of them, but we're only going to apply turquoise color to it if it's inside of something that's class foobar, no matter how far away foobar is. Like as long as it's inside of there, it's good. A very common kind of bug, if you're not writing less and you're writing normal CSS, is that you'll, even with less, frankly, if you write a selector like this, you can end up forgetting that it goes like deeply nested.
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of the time you write stuff like this and like, oh, there's only one span in there. It's fine. It's going to be great. Which is why in general also on our team, we don't like to just use span like this. Like we like to just, instead of saying span, let's just like, hey, let's give the span a name. Let's call it, I'm going to violate the semantic markup stuff, and we can make class turquoise, right? And we could say that instead of foobar or span, we're looking for things that have the class turquoise that are also within something called foobar. And that tends to help avoid some of the problem. So I'm just going to change this back real quick so we have a easier to reason about example. So that span class equals turquoise, and then this span equals turquoise, and we'll just go ahead and give them all class equals turquoise. This is descendant. So this space means descendant. So we're looking for class turquoise within class foobar. Here we're saying this means something different. So this doesn't mean descendant. That's called the child selector, or like a child operator. And what that means is that this turquoise, we're looking for things that have class turquoise that are specifically direct children of things that have class foobar. So here we're matching every turquoise element, which is inside foobar, which is a direct child of foobar. Let's make it font style normal. So you can see this is a direct child of a foobar, which is why it's not italic. Right, and grandchild and great-grandchild, they're still getting this one applied, but only the direct child gets this applied, just to make it more visible. That's the one that's going to be orange. This time we're going to do things that are turquoise and things that are huge, that have class huge. So now I can just go and say, okay, it's huge and it's turquoise, so I'm going to do font size 50 pixels. That one is huge. The reason that I'm doing that is because if there's no space here, right? If there had been a space here, it would have meant things that have class huge, which are inside a thing that has class turquoise, which is inside a thing that has class foobar. But that's not what we did. We had no space. So by having no space, we're saying that find things that have class turquoise and class huge, and then within things that have class foobar. And really selected is like a better example anyway, so selected, because that's what ends up happening a lot, like for your nav, right? In our nav, we might actually make it so that when you click on it or select it or whatever, it like lights up different. So then if we wanted to do this one, this is just to kind of draw out the difference. So this would be saying things that have class selected within things that have class turquoise within things that have class foobar. So but going back to this example, if I saw this here, this selector in code, I would almost certainly think it's a mistake. Because chances are you meant to do that, right? Right, and like this might be a valid selector to write, but it just, because it looks so similar to something confusing, I would assume that there might be a problem. And really with any of these, anytime where you have like spaces involved to do descendant selectors, you're better off just using less and nesting, because then you avoid all this detail. It's good for you guys to know this, and it's helpful for debugging, but like when you can avoid it, great. Because yeah, as you can imagine with a bunch of different CSS files, and the fact that if you're writing the selector, it applies globally. Back before we used less, we used to have basically apprentice level people writing CSS for different pages, and like people would constantly break each other's styles.
Oh, geez.
Because they would be like, you know, they would just be like, oh, I want all of my like divs to look a certain way, and then all of a sudden you would refresh your page after pulling, and it would be like totally screwed up. And so this is a pseudo selector. Why it's named that, I don't know exactly, but it's what it's saying is that like, hey, like when you have so turquoises that are inside of foobars. We already have styles for that. In this case, though, we're saying anytime the mouse is hovered over turquoises that are inside of foobars, then apply these rules. Apparently, they're not even called pseudo selectors, which is probably pseudo classes actually makes more sense than pseudo selectors. So there you go. So unvisited link. So if you want to have the link's visited style be purple and that one be blue, there's your mouse over. And so what that means is it's like as you're actively clicking on it. So maybe it's underlined as you're hovering, and then when you're clicking, it's going to be like, I'm going to normalify it. So we'll make it bold. So knowing what we already do about how to either have something be a display block or be part of the normal flow with display inline and have it behave as text, we could create 3-column layout without going to floats yet, though. How can we do this with display block display inline? So container under top bar, Let's give it some color so we can see what it is. So just as a reminder, if we were in less, we would be served well by doing this, right? And then that would make
definitely.
that would actually translate this into the nesting would create rules that look like that. But we're not in less right now, so let's just say container under the top bar, and let's just make it really obvious right now. So it's background red, and it's not showing up at all. So, oh, but it's completely full, right?
Yeah, full, yeah.
So if I give it padding 50 pixels,
yeah, there we go.
So maybe we better do that just so we can see what's going on. Smaller though. There we go. Okay, so what I want to do is turn this into a 3-column layout.
So if you stick inline on container under the top bar, but then you'll also have to make sure that your sub columns are not taking up the entire thing.
So set display inline here because I want this red thing to be in the normal flow.
No, I want everything inside of the red thing to be in the normal flow.
Gotcha. How would I accomplish that?
So would you do it on each of the children?
Exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
So we would have to do that on each one of the children to make them behave like text.
Cool.
And now we have a 3-column layout. Now there's a unfortunate trade-off to this approach. Not trade-off isn't even the right word. More like disqualifying fact, which is that this is now these things that are divs are display inline, which is fine. Weird, not recommended. Weird, right? Because it confuses people who come to the code later and they're like, "What the heck? What's going on? Why is this div display inline? Divs are never display inline." We have a bunch of stuff in here right now, which happens to be inline elements. But as soon as I start putting block stuff inside of inline stuff, the going gets weird. Things are getting weird. And just as you remember from last time, we don't ever do that. Like we don't want to put display block stuff inside of display inline stuff because now what the heck is even going on? Like I'm hovering over that. I can't even understand. I see where it starts kind of, but it seems to like have maybe no width. It's set, it has auto width, and it's just acting real weird, and it's going to be a real bad time. So let's not do that. So that approach is bogus because these columns might need to have display block stuff inside of them, i.e. things that don't behave like text inside of them. So instead of display inline, what are we going to do? And that brings us to floats. So how do we get around this problem? Floats are the easiest way. So if we want these guys, which are currently display block things, so my recommendation: never use float on a display inline element. And it's just for the same reason as like never put a display block thing inside a display inline thing. Similarly, we never want to apply float to a display inline element. It might work, it might be fine, but it's weird and it kind of defeats the purpose and it's confusing. Never do display inline. We put float on a display block element though. So here we have our 3 columns. And I'm gonna apply float left to each one. It smushes them up right next to each other. And then right away you can see the problem that we're gonna need to talk about next. So our container, which is red here, is acting funny. See if I can make it more obvious.
Is it because the children no longer like float outside of the parent element?
Yeah. I don't know if it's I don't know what's going on. It's like they're still there, you know?
Yeah.
And actually I've made it confusing because I made this one fatter, so I'm gonna make it smaller again. I just wanted it to be taller. In fact, just for the sake of being less confusing, I'm gonna change our card things into divs. You can see that even display block things inside, you know, they're behaving normally, and then the width of our floated display block thing, it's whereas normally the width of a display block element is going to expand to fill the container, if you don't specify otherwise. Here it's like by making it float, it no longer is expanding to fill the space, and instead it's like shrinking to wrap around the content. Is it because it's floating outside? I don't know, but basically for the purpose of the browser, what ends up happening is that like the height of whatever is containing floated elements, which should always be, you know, in the same way that we always never apply float to a display inline element, like never put floated elements inside a display inline element. Probably seems pretty obvious because it's like, hey, if you have an anchor tag that says click here to learn more, it'd be weird to put something floated inside of that text. Inline is just text. So again, like you probably could, but don't And it's like, once you understand more what these things are and you've used them, like it'll make sense to never do that, but just as a general rule of thumb. So basically what ends up happening is like, as for this like red thing being so small like that, is that because everything inside of it has been floated, its height has dropped to 0. And if I did have something inside of it that was not floated, like I had some more stuff that's not floated, so that display block element is still, that div, right, is display block by default, it's still expanding all the way to fill its container. And then it's pushing down anything that's floated until after it. So floated elements can like stack up next to each other, but display block stuff that's not floated still has its way. So like we've so far talked about floats, how they like to hang out with each other, like Miss Yellow, Miss Pink, and Miss whatever Cyan. And then we got this other one up here, and so it's like a display block sibling. And so floats, like when they have to play with display block siblings that are not floated, the display block siblings always win that fight, the unfloated display block siblings. If they have display inline siblings, then it works a little differently. So if we did want this to be like a newspaper, that's the origin of floats, and that's kind of like where you would traditionally, I guess, maybe use it in the days before kind of richer web pages. Even if you were doing it now in an article, I'm not sure you would do it that way, because you don't see that a ton online anyways. Usually stuff will be laid out like in the middle or kind of like BuzzFeed style. I'm sure it's still places though. So like if we say like newspaper, lots of newspaper text. So I'm gonna make it span. So this is more unfloated display block stuff. And then actually we'll just make it a span, whatever. More unfloated display inline stuff, because remember you never want to have floated display inline stuff. So the display inline stuff is actually off to the right because we're doing float left for all three of these things. So they're floating off to the left of this normal flow. So if I really cram it in there, and I also put it afterwards, not just before. So when I put it just before, right, it's just like newspaper text, newspaper text, newspaper text, and then eventually when I get to the display float stuff, it's like floated to the left. It's like it tries to fit it into the normal flow still, but it's like floating. And then same thing for the text that comes afterwards. It's just like a really weird newspaper article. Another thing you can do, and we haven't actually addressed the height issue. We'll come back to that though. You can also do float right, and you can even float some things left and some things right at the same time. So I float everything right. It goes to the right. You'll notice something weird though about float right that's important to remember, lest it confuse you later. Is like, you see in the HTML, I list first left side nav, then main content card stream, then right bonus widget. But left side nav has feed and TechCrunch in it, and then look where it's actually located now.
Yeah, because it comes first.
And so it's like float that one to the right first, then float this guy to the right, and then float this one to the right. Float one of them to the right and one of them to the left. Let's say that we wanted to float the middle thing to the left instead of floating it to the right. Middle thing being this magenta bit. Now it's off to the left, and these guys are floated to the right. So I'm gonna kill the newspaper stuff for a second, just because, in my experience at least, you almost never need to use it that way. But you will see, like, so if you have display inline stuff floating around, like in the same container as floats, that display inline stuff, as usual, is the normal flow. It's behaving like text. It behaves like the newspaper text, and the floated element behaves like the picture. If there's display block stuff, it behaves just like normal, takes up its whole line, and then the floated stuff kind of works like normal flow style display inline things, except it's its own category. So before we had this div in here, and you can see that the red box had expanded to surround the div. But if I get rid of that div, the red box has a height of 0, and the only thing we actually see of it is its padding right now. And you can see its dimensions are 529 pixels about by 0 height, and then it's just got 5 pixels of padding. The reason for that is that floated elements do not count towards the height of their parent. There's 2 solutions for this, at least. There may be more. There's 2 solutions that have historically been common. And this process that we're talking about is called clearing a float. All clearing a float means is just making the container stretch around all the floats inside of it and actually count them towards its height. So
use position.
Position is its own category, and I would recommend never mixing it with floats. Because yeah, position is sort of like we talked about normal flow, right? And we talked about display block, which is a way to say like it's a heading, take up the whole line. And then normal flow is like everything else, just text and stuff. And then we talked about floats, which is like I got a newspaper article and I want some pictures in the newspaper article to like flow within the text. And then you can abuse this float thing for layout stuff, which is what we're gonna do right now. It just has this weird property of the height not stretching around it. the height of the parent element doesn't stretch to wrap around any floated elements within it. Position, absolute positioning, and just the position attribute, the z-index attribute, the left, top, bottom, and right attributes. And I'm calling them attributes, but they're probably called something else. Properties, rules, yeah. Those things, those things we will talk about next time around, because it's kind of its own topic. That one's a little bit more complicated just because of z-index. So the height, is it because of, I don't know what it's because of, to be honest, Madison. I just know you have to clear the floats. So to clear the floats, you have two ways to do it. Because what you're trying to do is make the container wrap around its contents properly, I find that the most obvious thing to do is to change something about the container. So what I like to do is go in here and you put overflow auto, and that's it. Problem solved. And what that does is it forces this element's height to expand, or forces element's automatically computed height to expand to include like floated, and it's not even children, it's descendants. So like to include descendants elements which have been floated. And apparently overflow hidden works as well. But let me just, I'll just go out there and say, like, unless you're doing like a very specific CSS hack that you fully understand, like just stick with using overflow auto, because it makes it behave in a way that will make sense. And if it needs to get scroll bars, it will, kind of, which you generally probably don't want the scroll bars anyways, which is why you don't normally want to use overflow, really. And if you're making a nice responsive layout, like, you don't really need to mess with overflow ever, unless it's to clear floats. There's actually another CSS rule called clear. Apparently this other method, the trick is you have to put it last after, it has to be the sibling after all of the floats. I don't use that approach, but the other thing about this is you have to actually add something to the HTML, and like when possible, I think it's useful to try to keep like purely morphological changes in the CSS. So like this is something that requires, if you want to clear floats this way, you have to actually put another element on your page.
More work.
It seems worse.
So let's go back to the old way. So I'll bring back overflow auto, and where do I put overflow auto to clear this float? Standard to be stretched. Perfect.
I guess because your columns are still divs, you can still use margin to add a little space on either side.
Totally, and that would be okay. Margin.
And if you wanted to make like your main contents card stream center, you would just do the margin right auto, margin left auto, and that would still work.
No, that's a great
or would that not
question.
work?
That would, I'm pretty sure, not work.
Okay.
So
how would you center that?
Good question. So first of all, let's fix the float so that it looks less confusing. So let's just make them all float the same direction, which I like to use left in that situation just to make it like
linear.
Yeah. So there we are, and as you can see, it's not centered, it's just stacking. Actually, before we move on, because it's kind of related to what you were saying, Madison, I'm going to clone the main content card stream a bunch of times. And I just want to show you guys what happens. So whenever you see like a, Pinterest, like it's kind of got this going on, right? Where it's like block, or square, and they're all kind of like next to each other. And then let's go ahead and give it a quick margin left. I know this doesn't actually solve your problem, Madison, but just to show how that actually works. And we'll only put margin left on the middle ones. See, off it goes. It looks a little weird. If we put margin left on all of them, it probably is going to look more like something we'd want to interact with. Although there's some funny business there. I suspect it is a difference in the margins, but...
Is it just because that first feed TechCrunch is a little bit wider, so it's just compopulating everything?
Oh, that's probably it. Yeah. Mystery solved. So actually, this helps explain why you can't just, as John said before, springs, like margin left, margin auto, or margin left auto, margin right auto is like taking springs and setting them on either side of the div. But here, if we took springs on either side of these magenta things, like,
it's dependent on how wide the side things are.
Totally. It's dependent on its siblings, like the other content within the container, because it's siblings. And it's also dependent upon the container itself. And like as I resize my browser, for example, it's going to cause it to flow differently. So it's actually pretty handy to get some amount of like responsiveness without necessarily having to like do a bunch of media queries, because you can kind of works right there. Like you can kind of read that. All right, so if we wanted to center like all three of these guys, the simplest way to do that would be to add another div.
Yep, and then put the margin right and margin left auto on that div.
Exactly, and I'll just do it inline so we can see it. right there. Except that in and of itself is not enough. It's not that it doesn't know the width, it's that it's just too fat.
Is there a way to like make it equal to the wide, like to the width of your content without specifying a pixel number?
Not without margin negative 50% hack that I used to use in like 2009. And then I still weirdly remember it was my glass house class. Why it was called that, I have no idea. So there's ways to do it you can find that don't use Flexbox, but you can also do that with Flexbox.
Yeah, Flexbox is great.
In reality, though, I would caution you, if you were trying to center something that way, ask yourself why. Like here, I know how wide this is going to be, right? And in fact, in pretty much any 3-column layout, like the widths of my columns are set. And not only are they set, I kind of want to control them, and it might vary at different screen widths. So like as I shrink down, I might want to expand the width of this left nav. And they're not doing a whole lot of responsive stuff here because also people have like mostly moved into doing like more mobile optimization than just the responsive layout for a site like Quora, right? But if this was like a marketing website, then, and I'm sure if you go to like one of our customers and you look at their marketing website, there's a chance like if they're using WordPress or something, it's going to be jumbled with those intermediate like widths. I just noticed as we were doing it, you guys see what the height of this div is? It's sneaky. It's over there on the right side, the one that I'm hovered over here. How many pixels tall is it? So there's two places you can look in the inspector. So one is, as you can see, it's actually hovering, or like as I hover, it says div 529.43. And then in that blue section down on the bottom left where it's like margin border padding, you can see the dimensions on the very inside blue rectangle.
Yeah.
So that's how tall it is.
Which is 0 pixels. Yeah. And the reason it's 0 pixels tall?
The floats?
Right, because it's not stretching around its contents like it would normally because all of its contents are floated. So to get around that.
Oh, right.
Okay.
So you got to do that. If you want the other things to obey, you have to keep putting it on there. I'll make the sneaky div
sneaky.
Although now we have to make overflow auto so that there you go.
Yeah, looks good.
So what do we want to do? We want to center it. So what I would probably do is look to see what the width is that's appropriate given what our content's going to be. And for whatever reason, for width, like you pretty much always know the width of the content because you're at least thinking about it as you scale. Like for the heights, it's a lot more likely that the height will be dynamic just because a lot of times there'll be text that wraps and then just goes on and on and on and on and on. But we live in an internet culture where people don't scroll left to right very often. So let's give it width, I don't know, 480 is a vertical, well, like the classic vertical or like portrait tablet width. So there's about a portrait tablet. It looks like we can go smaller. So, but if I go 320, that's probably gonna be too small, right? Yeah, that's gonna make it wrap. So I'll just do like, I don't know, 380, something like that. And we're getting close enough. You could do the same thing with like a max width and a percentage width, right? So you can make this kind of like grow, the orange bit could grow or shrink and it would stay centered. But yeah, for whatever reason, you just don't normally have to make it wrap. If you needed to, I would go Flexbox. Like if you found yourself truly in that situation, I would first ask yourself, do I really need this? Because usually the answer is no. And then I would ask like, is this something I can accomplish with positioning, like absolute positioning instead? And chances are you can. If there's just really no other way around it and you do have dynamic width content that's going to be floated up next to each other and you need to center those 2 or 3 columns or more of like dynamic width content when they're all added together, then that's where you're going to want to use Flexbox to solve that problem. Never use important if you feel you need to. Here's what you do. So let's say that we're really struggling and we want to apply some styles to this pink thing. And we're like, okay, like I'm going in here and I'm saying like main content card stream, and I'm in my like little CSS world and I'm just like main content card stream background black, and it's working for me because it comes afterwards, even though it's the same level of specificity, right? But let's say somehow I got confused and I was up here and I'm like, okay, background black. Why isn't it black? Why isn't it black? I could go important and like that would make it black, but that's just a real dirty hack. We don't want to do that because that's going to make it harder for everyone else that needs to style it in the future. Luckily with less, this doesn't come up as much because you're not running into this situation all the time. But if we want to get around this, we first look, okay, like, is there anything about, if we're in a less file, like, is there anything in this less file that's going to be colliding with this, that's like the same level of specificity? And if so, then I'm going to like, I want to find it and just like put this rule there, right? Why do I need to have it here? Or I can like make, maybe it's like there's somewhere else that's doing like one of these where it's like main content card stream and like other fun cards to have, and then more stuff even. I am just matching lots of things. Right? The comma is just, this is like a, if it matches that, comma, or this, comma, or this, comma, or this, right? And you can, each one of these comma separated sections can be as specific as the selector as you want. The comma is just a way to like lump things together. If you've got a bunch of styles you don't want to copy and paste.
Interesting.
So if I have like the main content card stream is like background gray, and then I want to set it to background black, well, it's still actually going to be pink.
Basically, just type one instance of background gray for all 4 of those at once, instead of those separated to 4 different like selectors.
Exactly, because you have to repeat yourself for everything inside of it, right? Whereas this way, you can actually just say the shared things, and then you can have underneath like, okay, here's the override just for this one. Like we're gonna do like, it'll still be gray, but I'll make the text color like red. And so now it's red, but then like any of these other guys would still have the default text color. But anyway, so if you find yourself in this situation and you're like, I don't know, it's not just doing what I want. Like I'm putting it up here and it's not working, of course, because the way the specificity works is it's like, this counts as like a separate selector. The comma is just like lumping them together for the purpose of sharing these rules. So it's still gray, still overriding. So the thing to do there is just to put it either inside or put it afterwards. And if there's not a clean way to do that, then you can make this one more specific instead of putting it afterwards. So if I was to make it more specific by doing that, then it's going to be red. So never use important. Okay, and last but not least, conventional stuff, ordering for stuff like media queries and pseudo selectors. So this kind of gets more into like our conventions. Cool. So as you can see, we have pseudo classes. Pseudo classes are listed last, and then we also have this tendency to put these ampersand things. Now this is like a less specific deal, right? That's not going to work in vanilla CSS.
Yeah.
But we like to put those last as well.
Okay.
Within their section, right? So that's just somewhere where you can go find like that. You know where to look to see those guys. And then here, the media queries are at the very bottom. And because the media queries are always going to be for an entire page, like you never have to worry about like, and I would say like, not only you not have to worry, like it would be confusing if you were to put this media selector within other stuff up here.
Oh, yeah.
That's to keep it just kind of at the top level. And then if you need to like go deep into the stuff elsewhere, you can like just recreate that tree, like recreate the selectors that you need within the media query, and then it'll apply like when it takes effect. Well, that is all I have at the moment, guys. This is a pretty short one.